I'm going to be doing an injustice to this panel by starting off with the most egregious mistake of speaking about masculinities only from the perspective of adolescent girls and young women, but that will be corrected by the rest of my esteemed panelists as we go forward. So concern yourselves not with the rest of the panel, and I apologize, funding restrictions limited us to just looking at this from the perspective of adolescent girls and young women. Next slide. I just want to quickly highlight our funders and collaborators, thank IRH and FHI and their learning collaboration on norms for the opportunity to submit this piece to the special issue that they edited. I really also want to thank Strive, the structural drivers of HIV/AIDS or Research Partner Consortium, and all of my colleagues there who really brought this project to light and are the reason this project took place conceptually, certainly. So next slide, please. So this work came out of our efforts in, my colleague and my efforts in Strive to review the social science as well as epidemiological literature on transactional sex and the role it plays in increasing young women's risk to HIV. And in that effort, we noted that across the many sets of motivations or paradigms in the literature from the social science perspective, while there were many differences, what was certainly shared was that they're all structured by gender inequalities, and most importantly, by this, all of transactional sex is really structured by this underlying gendered expectation that men should provide for women in romantic relationships and families. And yet, this notion of male provision, while in its importance in the social science literature, had not been operationalized at all or tested in the more epidemiological literature as to help us understand the mechanisms through which transactional sex might increase women's risk of HIV. In fact, the work on the epidemiological side at the time, although there's been many contributions since, really had not yet identified many pathways or mechanisms through which transactional sex seem to be statistically significantly, at least, increasing women's HIV risk. The one area that had received a lot of attention was at the relationship power dynamic level. Next slide, please. So our work really set out to try to develop measures that could assess the gendered social dimensions of women's HIV risk as it relates to this underlying expectation of men's provision to women in relationships. And we really wanted to better understand whether there were gender norms that were attached or sort of stemmed from that broad expectation around male provision, as well as the extent to which there are internalized gender beliefs held at the individual level. And that work is still in development and is a scale that we're producing that I'd be happy to talk more about, but I'm gonna focus on the development efforts around these gender norm measures for the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So the methods that we used, this was a measurement development effort. We leveraged work that had already taken place led by my collaborator, Nambusi Chiagombe, with the LINEA project, in fact, in 2 districts in Uganda. And we conducted this work over the course of about a year and a bit through 4 iterative phases, including a reanalysis of secondary data, our own 10 focus group discussions, cognitive interviews, and then finally the pilot survey itself. Next slide, please. So I want to launch into the way in which we went to measure the presence of gender norms stemming from expectations around male provision, because that's what I'm going to talk about for the remainder, which the methodology we used were experimental vignettes. And so this is a survey. These are small stories that are placed into a quantitative survey, and they are manipulated at random such that a subset of participants will receive one version of a story and another subset will receive another version of the story. And they can be manipulated in multiple ways. In our case, we kept it very simple because our sample size was ultimately very small in this small pilot study. So if you just click once, you can see this was one of the vignettes that we used. John and Sarah have been in a relationship for some time. He has been providing Sarah with a little money for her to buy clothes and airtime for her cell phone. Last week, he asked her to have sex for the first time. She said she wasn't ready. John became angry with her. Can you click again? And then again. So the first 50% of our participants received that first version of the vignette, and the other 50% received this other version of the vignette. So for the other 50%, John was providing things important to Sarah. He's given her a smartphone, and he gives her any money she says she needs. And so this was repeated across our the vignettes that we tested, such that in each case, the vignette varied by the level of provision the man was providing in the vignette. And then all respondents answered the same questions where they evaluated their own attitude, a descriptive norm concerning how many men or women, depending on the actor, behaved, they would perceive to behave as the protagonist does in this vignette. And then they also assessed their own their perceptions around levels of approval for different social groups to assess injunctive norms. Next slide, please. So we developed these vignettes over a number of phases of data collection. We used our own focus groups to build vignettes that were based off of secondary analysis of previously collected qualitative data. And we used those focus groups also to develop appropriate manipulations of the vignette and to identify relevant reference groups to adolescent girls and young women in this study. We then used cognitive interviewing to refine the vignettes, and then finally conducted the vignette experiment with 108 respondents. Next slide, please. And the vignettes themselves, really the domains that we were testing came from our literature review, looking at what we expected to follow from expectations of male provision. So what that buys men is male authority in relationships, male control of sexual decision-making, and then we also tested norms around women's use of their erotic power or sexual agency to access support from men. Next slide, please. Was that my time up, or does that mean I have just a few minutes?
A few more minutes.
Okay. So these were the vignettes that were included. There were others that sort of fell off through the course of the development of the vignettes, and I'm happy to talk about that during the discussion. But I don't think I'm going to have time to go through these in much detail. But in each case, we were reviewing levels of male provision, and then testing whether or not the provision level itself changed approval around men's authority, around men's sexual decision-making, and around women's engagement in having multiple partners. Next slide, please. I think I'm going to skip. So I will I will skip this, yeah, just to be able to talk to you about the results in language rather than numbers. So in every vignette, we were examining whether the level of presence of provision of material support changed social expectations for men's or women's behavior. So in the case of expectations around authority, we did not find that there was a change in levels of social approval or disapproval as a result of, with respect to his authority. But we did find it had an impact on the respondents' own attitude. So that respondents were more approving themselves of men's authority when provision levels were higher. Click again. We did find, as we expected, that there was a shift in levels of approval in response to greater levels of approval for men having control over sexual decision-making when levels of provision were higher. That was perceived at the community level and also at the individual attitudinal level. And then finally, we click again, we also found that men's provision did influence norms around women having a second partner. So if the primary partner didn't provide very much, women perceived that other women would approve if she took on a second partner. But if the primary partner provided more, then they would approve less of her taking on a second partner. So in conclusion, next slide, we find that there are implications here for intervention, really around, we would suggest those interventions that are tackling gender norm change should try to disentangle expectations of male provision from male sexual control, or expectations and normative expectations around male sexual control in those relationships. And that's especially important if there's increased social acceptance at the peer level for women to take on multiple partners in contexts where the primary partner does not provide enough. And I will address issues and questions around vignette experiments in the discussion. Sorry for going over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. And yes, we will have time to go back to those questions. And we are lucky as well to have Nambuzi today with us, which was part of the project. And as Kirsten mentioned, also part of this sort of, she was a principal investigator of the LINEA formative research. So we have the whole, well, part of the team. So next we will have Lottie Howard-Merrill, and she will be, well, as you know, Lottie is a research fellow for LINEA, and she's part of the Gender Violence and Health Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She runs the LINEA Network Communications, including the webinars, and is currently helping finalize the development of the multi-component intervention to prevent HD-spread transactional sex we are finalizing. And Lottie will be presenting on constructions of masculinities and transactional sex, a qualitative study from Northwestern Tanzania. And I think it really connects with a lot of the things that Kirsten has been saying. So it will be a nice follow-up.
I'm going to turn my video off so you don't have to all watch me trying to multitask. So anyway, here we go. Let me start the timer. Share my slides. Okay. So hi everyone, and thanks Anna Maria for the introduction. Today I'm presenting on data on men's role in transactional sex from the LINEA formative research. I'm pleased to say that this paper, a paper with this title, was accepted for publication last month at Culture, Health and Sexuality, and I'm hoping it will be online any day now. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Joyce Wamoyi, Daniel Nyato, Nambusi Kiegombe, Laurie Heisey, and Anna Maria Buller. So I am building on Kirsten's explanation of transactional sex in the previous presentation. And I also wanted to say that we're using the definition from the Transactional Sex review paper she led. The LINEA formative research has been investigating emic perspectives of transactional sex from Tanzania, Uganda, and Brazil. And we acknowledge that individuals' experiences of material exchange in transactional sex may span exploitation, agency, and love over different relationships or over the course of one relationship. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be referring to age-disparate transactional sex, relationships between adult men and adolescent girls. These relationships, even more than other types of transactional sex relationship, are characterized by inequitable gender relations, age disparities, and economic inequalities. And therefore, in this realm, it's clearly a form of sexual exploitation and abuse of adolescent girls, with negative implications for their mental, physical, and sexual health. So the aim of this research, and what I will hopefully start to do in this presentation, is to seek greater clarity on men's behaviours within and perspectives of transactional sex relationships with adolescent girls. I'm going to unpack the role of men and boys in transactional sex and consider multiple masculinities in doing so. And ultimately, the aim of this work is to strengthen initiatives working with men and boys to shift social norms for greater gender equity and to prevent sexual exploitation and violence against women and girls. Data collection was led by Joyce and Daniel at the National Institute for Medical Research in Tanzania in phase 1 of LINEA. The research participants were comprised of younger men between the ages of 14 and 24 years old, and older men who are older than 24 years old, and they were sampled using a snowball methodology. Interview participants were selected purposively from the focus group participants. Men researchers conducted all of the focus groups and interviews in Kiswahili, and the interviews were transcribed and then translated into English. I led the analysis of this data in partnership with the other co-authors. I carried out a thematic analysis, coding the data using grounded codes, as well as codes based on the literature on transactional sex and social and gender norms theory. So the results. Men's accounts expose two dominant sets of gender norms, and they are that men are expected to provide economically within sexual relationships, and also that men should demonstrate their masculinity through heightened sexuality and sexual prowess. Throughout the results, I'm going to investigate how transactional sex allowed men an opportunity to either adhere to or question these norms. I'm also going to apply a social norms theory, a social norms lens, to consider the influence of reference groups and associated social sanctions. The data showed that men considered provision as inherent to being a man and an important marker of coming of age. An interesting narrative emerged among the young men in the sample about the need to work very hard to provide in transactional sex relationships, and also that their success in transactional sex relationships indicated their ability to provide for future imagined families and therefore signaled to their communities about their eligibility for marriage. Older men, on the other hand, openly described leveraging their earning power to engage in transactional sex with adolescent girls, using the gift method to trick and trap adolescent girls into having sex with them. The data also showed interesting examples of competition within reference groups of men based on access to resources. Those unable to provide good enough gifts in return for sex were outcompeted by others better able to provide. And this is shown in the quote in the title of this presentation. I trap her with a CD, then tomorrow you find her with a big old man who bought her a smartphone. In terms of sexuality, men describe their sexual desire as a biological and often uncontrollable. Like with provision, uncontrollable sexual desire signified to participants a coming of age for men. Monogamy was considered unlikely to satisfy men who were thought to have a natural curiosity or desire to try new things. Adolescent girls, on the other hand, were considered more sexually attractive and adventurous than adult women, and men's wives in particular. Using a social norms lens to look at reference groups, we identified that men are able to gain status, or what they called swag, among their peers by boasting about their sexual practices, including being able to satisfy girls sexually and having sex with a large number of girls of a particularly young age, and also having sex with virgins. Some men described openly ridiculing those who are unwilling or unable to seduce women and girls in transactional sex relationships. Importantly, not all of the participants in the sample condoned transactional sex. Older men criticised their peers for participating in transactional sex, accusing them of wasting money that they should have been using to provide for their families, as shown in this top quote. He has lost his self-awareness that he has a responsibility for his family. He forgets that when he has more than one partner, his expenses will be too high and there are important things his family is going to miss. Older men also accuse their peers of failing to act as a responsible or respectable member of the community, as shown in the quote on the right, which says, "My friends always come and say, the wife at home is tiresome, my friend. Escort me here. But I don't need to embarrass myself and to lose dignity and respect." Another example is that younger men suggested that older men relying on gift giving were incapable of seducing adolescent girls and women otherwise. And the final quote says, "I think that somebody who gives up money to get sex, his muscles are small. When you don't have money, the sex stops there." So this study suggests that transactional sex presents an opportunity for men to enact provider norms and heighten sexuality norms. And additionally, that it enables them to align with the hegemonic masculinity as it upholds gendered inequalities and maintains men's social dominance over women. In particular, transactional sex enabled men to perpetuate women and girls' economic dependence on men, and also allowed men to differentiate themselves from girls who they described as easy to manipulate. We also found that men's participation in and perspectives of transactional sex are influenced by reference groups of other men and relevant sanctions. For example, men less able to adhere to the provision norm were outcompeted for transactional sex partners, which is a form of sanction from the girl, and therefore also lost status among their peers, which was a form of sanction from other men. Our data suggests that young men in particular were attempting to mitigate the threat of social sanctions by partaking in preemptive behaviours and narratives, such as highlighting how hard they had to work to provide for transactional sex partners. Finally, our research suggests that men who question the practice of transactional sex or criticise other men partaking in transactional sex continue to uphold rigid and harmful gendered expectations of men. Examples mentioned in this presentation include men chastising their peers for risking being unable to adequately provide for their families, and younger men suggesting that those who take part in transactional sex would not be able to seduce women and girls without using their resources. This shows that targeting men's participation in transactional sex alone will not address the gendered inequalities which are so harmful to adolescent girls' health and well-being. Transactional sex must be tackled as part of broader gender transformative programming. In addition, it may be possible to identify examples of resistance to transactional sex in programming, but this must be complemented with reflection on positive alternatives to harmful gendered expectations. The findings on reference groups also suggest that groups of men could be mobilised to mutually encourage each other to adopt alternative behaviours. This study has some limitations. First of all, sampling meant that the study had strong ecological validity but limited generalisability to the wider population. In addition, we sampled older men who had participated in transactional sex, so important data is missing on the views and behaviours of older men who did not participate in transactional sex. Finally, as this was a cross-sectional study, we were not able to investigate how the views and experiences of younger men may have changed over time as they grew older. Despite these limitations, this study has produced evidence that transactional sex provides men with an opportunity to adhere to gendered expectations. Our findings also suggest that men are heavily influenced by sanctions exerted within reference groups of other men. And finally, we've started to show how age and access to resources have an important influence on men's participation in and attitudes towards transactional sex. Thank you very much. And I've included the DOI for our publication. So yes, the PDF is going to go on the Padlet, and I would love it if you read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lottie, very much for keeping to time as well. We will hear the horn at any point. So you know, there's the chimes are, you have 2 minutes, and then the horn means you finish the presentation. So as you see, I think this presentation has nicely built up on Kirsten's presentations, and I hope we can have a conversation on those gender norms and what each set of results tell us about it. But now we are going to continue with Rachel Marcus, Rachel is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. She has more than 25 years experience as a social development researcher and practitioner, and she has particular expertise in conducting rigorous evidence reviews with a focus on gender, youth, and social inclusion.
Hi, thank you very much, Anne-Maria. Good afternoon, everybody. So as you can see from the title of my presentation, which I now can't see. Oh, no, I can.
It will come.
So this is the outlier of the presentations, because I'm not talking directly about transactional sex, but hopefully the insights from what I am going to talk about on sexual harassment may be relevant to the broader theme of transactional sex. So could I have the next slide, please? So what I'm presenting comes from an evidence review that I did as part of the GAGE Gender, Adolescence and Global Evidence Programme, which is funded by DFID, with my co-authors Maria Stavropoulou and Nandini Archer-Gupta. And the sexual harassment was quite a small part of this wide-ranging study that looked at programmes working with adolescent boys and young men to promote gender equitable masculinities on a range of issues, including intimate partner violence, gender roles, couple communication, and also covering issues such as child marriage, their views on girls' participation in sport, and a number of other issues too. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I've extracted data on just the programs directly relevant on sexual harassment, and then a little bit also on programs which recorded broader impacts on sexual relationships. The program designs were quite varied, so they all had non-formal education on gender equality, raising gender awareness, but many of them did other things too. So they, for example, ran football or cricket programs, and then included modules on gender awareness alongside the sports, or some of them were part of broader reproductive and sexual health programs, and contained a stronger element on challenging masculinities. Some were very focused on preventing gender-based violence. This being funded by DFID, the focus was on low and middle-income countries, and the programs in this study spanned all regions, so Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and Southeast Europe, so everywhere that was low income by World Bank definitions at the time. Sorry, low and middle income. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives an overview of the kinds of norms of masculinity that the programs were trying to change. You can see that they were quite varied. On this slide, I've tried to pull out the ones that were most relevant to the theme of sexual harassment. There were others, including particularly norms around men's role as breadwinners. Next slide, please. So to move on to our findings then, next slide, please. All the studies, so the 12 studies that looked at findings on sexual harassment, they all recorded some degree of positive change. This was partly because many of them were qualitative, and if a study presented evidence of shifts in attitudes or behaviour as reported by the study participants, and we coded that as positive change. Obviously we weren't able necessarily, especially doing an evidence review, and so we were looking at a whole set of evaluations and not always able, in fact never able, to follow up with the authors to find out the degree of change. So we just had to take those as a simple sort of binary, either positive change or not. And also 4 of them recorded positive change in behaviour and 3 in attitudes. Thank you. Next slide, please. So they were a mix of qualitative and quantitative findings, summarised here. So we separated out changes in attitudes and changes in behaviour. None of the studies looked directly at norms, but the evidence that the evidence that they put forward served as a proxy for change in norms. So we found, for example, reduced agreement that girls and women provoke assault by dressing in a sexy manner, and that was statistically significant in those two initiatives. Two led to reduced perpetration of sexual violence, and one of them also recorded a reduction in transactional sex. Next slide, please. And I'm going to move here on to some of the quotes from the qualitative studies, or the mixed method studies. So what was emerging quite strongly from those that did have qualitative data was that adolescent boys and young men were engaging in sexual harassment in part because they were bored, and it was sort of a fun thing to do when they were hanging out in groups together. And they didn't really think about it. It was a sort of descriptive norm among their groups of friends that was an okay thing to do. So these two quotes from India and Ethiopia show that it was just sort of naturalized as a behavior. Next slide, please. But after taking part in these interventions, so in attending these non-formal education classes, which in the case of the programs in India ran over a relatively long period of time, a year or so. The programs, the Bihar program, which was a population council program, was longer. The Yoridosi was a bit shorter, and the one in Ethiopia, which was on the previous slide, was a shorter course, I believe, in the sort of 2 to 3 month region. But through participating in these programs, it was noticeable that the boys and young men talked about increasing in empathy. So that after participating in Yoridosi, my thoughts have changed. I now feel that the girls who are teased by the young boys suffer a lot, and we should respect them. And then one who equally related it to the fact that he had a mother or a sister. I can't stand such men. Torture or atrocity is not right. Even I have a mother and sister. This could be the case with them as well. So there really seemed to be a change in empathy that was driving behaviour change in these cases. Next slide, please. The other factor that seemed to make quite a difference was learning that it was illegal. So this young man said, now if I go to the market and see that a boy is harassing a girl, then I scold the guy. If I see someone doing wrong to a girl, then I go and tell them, if you don't stop such things, you'll be behind bars. I explain it to them. So that clearly that new knowledge that he learned through the program made quite a difference. I'm highlighting these because the programs didn't necessarily aim to have a collective discussion about what community norms or norms were among those groups. In a way, they worked on a more individual level, but they also led to a shift, which then led to the denormalization of sexual harassment in their social groups. Next slide, please. As I said, we drew on 12 studies in this part of the review, which is a relatively small number, but overall there are, reflecting on the broader review, there were quite a number of knowledge gaps. Before doing this, I'd done a review of programs working with adolescent girls to promote their development and more equitable gender norms, and compared to that, I was quite surprised by the narrowness of the programs working with boys and young men compared to the ones working with girls. They were a lot less focused on the boys' development, but also they were typically a lot less rigorously designed. So, while RCTs were a lot more common in the ones with girls, there were very few that were comparing different strategies in the initiatives working with boys. That meant that there was no very clear evidence on the value of different kinds of approaches, whether that was when to work in single gender and when to work in mixed gendered groups, or the types of curriculum and content that would be most useful. As you can see, I put a question as to whether greater use of mass media would be effective. These programs pretty much all were based on kind of facilitator-led discussion. From what we could see of the approaches they used, there wasn't much use of complementary sort of learning methods. What we also could not really tell from these studies, which tend to be a snapshot of time, is what the long-term effects were. One study did follow up after 2 years and found some evidence of lasting change and some waning of impacts. But because of the much more limited degree of investment in evaluations in this area, knowledge about what makes a difference is much less developed. Compared to the work that I'd done before looking at programs with adolescent girls. And also, I mean, in a way you would not expect this of an evaluation, but I will just finish. You not expect this of a set of evaluations or the evaluation of one project, but the literature doesn't really seem to be considering the relative effectiveness of investing in these quite small programs versus the much more comprehensive sexuality education that these young men could have been getting through school, at least the majority had been attending. So I understand I need to stop now. Thank you all very much.